Everybody knows the Vikings were no saints. For hundreds of years, they plundered and pillaged across Europe and beyond. But it's sometimes easy to forget just how twisted they really were. These are the most messed up things that happened during the Viking Age. The Vikings are probably best known for their prowess as sailors, but one of the grim benefits of their ability to travel fast and far was the huge network they set up to buy, sell, and capture slaves. According to National Geographic, the entire Viking economy was built on the slave trade, and a disturbing discovery made in the 1980s helped confirm that they kept slaves for themselves and even sacrificed them on the deaths of their masters. In 2014, the University of Oslo published its archaeological findings about a site in Flakstad, Norway in the Journal of Archaeological Science. The burial ground dated to sometime late in the Iron Age, between 550 and 1030, and 10 people were buried there. 3 were alone, but there were 2 double burials and 1 triple burial, and the remains of 4 skeletons were missing their heads. This isn't the only place where headless corpses have been found buried alongside other Viking remains, and it's evidence of a practice written about in the Icelandic sagas, burying sacrificed slaves with their dead masters. Before burial, the slaves are decapitated, done to differentiate between different social classes, then left in the grave as grave gifts for the slave owners.
Now we see the violence inherent in the system!
Contemporary sources tell us about sacrifices made by the Vikings to Odin, like the 99 people, horses, dogs, and hawks that were sacrificed every 9 years. Other stories suggest that Vikings assembled at Uppsala every 9 years to make sure they were still in good with the gods by sacrificing humans, horses, and dogs in sets of 9, then hanging them from the trees of the Holy Grove. Whether that story is true or just anti-Viking propaganda is contested among historians, but the National Museum of Denmark suggests that it's at least partially true. Evidence for this appeared when archaeologists excavated a sacrificial site at Trelleborg and found a well filled with animal bones and the skeletons of at least 5 human sacrifices. 4 of those people were children between the ages of 4 and 7. And that's not all. According to historian Harry Brown, all that pop culture nonsense about willing sacrifices is nonsense. Brown says there are no actual sources that mention the sacrifices being willing participants. In fact, it's probably quite the opposite. Ibn Fadlan, writing in the 10th century, told the tale of a slave girl who tried to back out of being a sacrifice. Instead of being freed, she was dragged to her execution, a death that only finally came after she was assaulted by 6 different men. Sadly for the Vikings, you can't be a ruthless marauder without having to face some consequences. In 2010, British archaeologists uncovered evidence of some pretty grisly events that found the Vikings on the receiving end of some hardcore Anglo-Saxon justice. Researchers from Oxford Archaeology excavated a site just outside Weymouth and found that the 55 Vikings buried in the mass grave weren't just executed, they were mutilated too. Reconstructing the scene, archaeologists say the men were forced to strip, then decapitated with blows from the front to ensure they could see it coming. Their faces and right ears also show extensive damage. These finds were likely the remains of the St. Brice's Day massacre, which happened on November 13, 1002 by order of England's King Ethelred the Unready. By that time, the English had been paying the Vikings to leave them alone, even as they continued to raid and pillage. Ethelred soon lost his patience and ordered a massacre of any Vikings his men could get their hands on. It's unclear how many died, but the Danish king Svein Forkbeard was beset with grief over the execution of his sister and her child, and the Anglo-Saxons ended up answering for their actions by 1013 when Forkbeard unleashed holy hell on England. Infanticide has been a shockingly common occurrence throughout history, and the Vikings were no different. The killing of children even had a place in their naming tradition. The whole concept of christening a child with a particular name comes from the Vikings. Their ritual was called Oisa Vatni, and it only happened after parents examined their child and decided he or she was worth raising. Children who weren't worth keeping were left to die by exposure, and according to historian Nancy L. Wicker's treatise on infanticide, it was most frequently done with girls. Records of Viking households suggest boys outnumbered girls at least 4-1, if not much more. Of course, the Vikings didn't view the death of an infant via exposure as murder as long as it was done before the Oisa Vatni. After the child was named and accepted into the family, it was a problem. But before? Totally cool. Viking longhouses were pretty nifty places. After all, who wouldn't want one in their backyard for barbecuing meats and drinking lots of mead? There's a catch, though, one that became painfully clear when researchers from Denmark's Aarhus University built their longhouse replicas, lit some fires, then tested the air. The houses were as authentically Viking as they could get, made with wattle and daub walls and thatching. They lit fires in the center of each house and monitored interior conditions for 15 weeks of winter. When they compared their findings to what the World Health Organization deems safe, safe, they found those cool Viking longhouses were constructed in a way that encouraged the collection of fine particles, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon monoxide. You know, the stuff we make special detectors to warn us about so we don't die snoring. While there was a hole in the roof for smoke, not all the smoke actually dissipated. That same roof design trapped a lot of it, and once it cooled, all the nastiness in the air dropped to ground level. They say short-term exposure wasn't too dangerous, but long-term exposure, like Viking women and children would have had, leads to things like respiratory infections, bronchitis, cerebrovascular disease, and cancer. Ah, the good old days. You probably thought hanging, drawing, and quartering was pretty messed up, but this particular form of punishment makes it look like a walk in the park. Vikings have long been famous for the blood eagle, which might sound all regal and super cool, but don't let the name lull you into a false sense of security. The blood eagle execution basically involved carving up someone's body to make it look like an eagle, wings and all, and if you're having trouble imagining that, just picture what would have to be done to your rib cage in order to make it resemble wings. After your ribs were hacked apart, your executioners would pour a salt solution into your wound, and then they would pull out your lungs and arrange them over your ribs. The good news is that we don't really know if the blood eagle was ever actually a thing. For centuries, historians believed it was, but most of the evidence for its use came from the Norse and Icelandic sagas, which are considered highly questionable historical sources since they were almost certainly embellished for entertainment value. All in all, this story is probably best taken with a grain of salt, and poured as a solution onto your broken ribcage. Luckily, modern people have tools that make the difficult task of lighting and maintaining a fire more or less a cinch. The Vikings had their own way of doing this too, though it's a little grosser than just gathering logs and squirting lighter fluid. The Viking method of fire starting involved a nifty little homemade tool that they could carry around with them, making it possible to start a fire pretty much anywhere. The tool was made from a fungus called Touchwood, which grows on the bark of beech and oak trees. The Vikings would harvest it and then beat and burn it until it was flat and thin like a piece of felt. Then, of course, they would boil it in human urine. Why did they do this? Because urine contains sodium nitrate, which turned the Touchwood felt into something that would smolder instead of burn. They would take this tool wherever they needed to go and use it to build fires and roast meat over the urine-fueled flames. Horses were extremely valuable during the Middle Ages. People depended on them for transportation, warfare, and to generally make themselves look cool while cantering across the grassy hillside. The Vikings, however, saw them as little more than an expendable resource. According to the National Museum of Denmark, horses were frequent victims of the infamous blot sacrifice, which basically involved spraying anything in sight with the blood of a number of unfortunate animals, and horses in particular. Participants would collect the blood in large bowls and then use twigs to splatter it all over the walls, the altars, and the people. Afterwards, everyone would have a fine meal of horse meat, so at least nothing went to waste. Now, it is true that a sacrifice was believed to have the greatest effectiveness when the thing being sacrificed had value. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be a sacrifice. So horses must have been valued in that sense, but that didn't stop the Vikings doing some seriously callous stuff with them, like pitting two stallions against each other for sport and betting on which one would kill the other. Being a Viking had its perks. If you didn't die, you got to loot and pillage at will, and if you did die, then you got to go to Valhalla and hang out with Thor, which honestly sounds like quite good fun. But for everyone else, it was absolutely terrifying, and when you knew that the Vikings were on their way, you really only had one rational option: run away. Sometimes, however, people tried other things. In fact, the Vikings had such a terrifying reputation that one group of nuns living in a Scottish convent decided that they'd better just go ahead and disfigure themselves rather than face a defiling at the hands of the invading Viking force. So instead of running, they cut off their noses and their upper lips. When the Vikings arrived, they were sufficiently put off by the horrible scene, but were also so enraged that they decided to burn down the convent and everyone in it.
Because we are Vikings.
When you think of Vikings, you likely think of Odin, Valhalla, and Thor. And the one thing that probably doesn't come to mind is Christmas. But Christian Vikings did exist. They appeared much later in the Viking Age, but eventually Christianity did come to Norway, and the Norse people decided to turn their winter solstice celebration into a Christmas celebration. They were still basically Vikings at heart, though, so it's not like they changed their ways overnight. To begin with, the Viking Christmas was pretty much all about getting drunk. In fact, the Christian Vikings were so serious about their holiday parties that King Haakon the Good decreed that not only did his people have to brew beer, especially for the season, they had to drink it too. And if they didn't, then they were subject to fines and loss of property, which frankly doesn't exactly sound awful, unless you had to pillage in the morning. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.